everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about getting the most DPS as possible out of your Elemental Shaman. To be clear, this is not a beginner's guide. This is more of an optimizations focused guide where you're squeezing every bit of damage you possibly can out of the spec with smaller but impactful improvements you can take over the course of a dungeon. If you're looking for more step-by-step talent breakdowns and rotations, I've linked a beginner's guide in the description for you to check out that I would recommend you look at first. But with that out of the way, let's jump into it. Going into Midnight, Elemental Shaman cooldown usage is arguably more important now than it's ever been, especially since we've lost deeply rooted elements. Right now, your entire burst profile is built around two buttons, being your Ascendance and your Stormkeeper. With Stormkeeper on a 1-minute cooldown and Ascendance on a 2-minute cooldown, they naturally line up nearly perfectly every time, so you should be thinking about them more as a paired cooldown rather than two separate buttons. Your default burst setup should always look the same. You want to precast Stormkeeper before you press Ascendance so the buff is already active and you are not wasting globals during your Ascendance window. You also want to take Blaze to get your Purging Flames buff and then pool around 50 Maelstrom before going into Ascendance. Since Ascendance itself generates a decent amount of Maelstrom, if you pool any higher than that, it risks overcapping and then losing significant value. But the reason I wanted to talk about cooldowns specifically is because a lot of people tend to hold their cooldowns longer than they should, and there are really only a few times you should ever hold them. Most of the time, the correct answer, if your cooldown is up, you hit it. But there are times that you do want to hold it, with the main one being that if you're not going to get the full value out of your Ascendance window. Think about it as basic as this. Ascendance lasts 15 seconds. If the pack is likely to die in 10 seconds or less, that's 5 seconds in your biggest cooldown window that you just completely wasted. In this situation, it is correct to hold Ascendance and then just wait for a pull where you can actually get the full value. The second time you should hold is when Stormkeeper is desynced from Ascendance by a small amount, usually around 10 to 15 seconds. Because Stormbringer and Ascendance work so well together, if either of them comes up early, it's almost always worth holding both so you can resync them up. So the core cooldown mindset is this: treat Ascendance and Stormkeeper as one single burst package. You send them together on default, only hold if you're not going to get the full duration value, and avoid overthinking desyncs because there's almost never a good reason to separate them. Now, I want to quickly touch upon Nature's Swiftness and Spirit Walker's Grace, because those are two buttons that matter way more than people realize. This version of Elemental is relatively immobile, with a huge chunk of your damage tied to hard casts, and every time you have to move without a plan, your rotation just kind of falls apart, especially in single target. Nature's Swiftness is your first safety net with that. Most of the time you want to send it on either an Elemental Blast or a Tempest, allowing you to turn one of those into instant cast and let your rotation flow through movement instead of having to stop everything entirely. The big mistake I see players make with Nature's Swiftness is that they either completely forget about it, or they're holding it forever for this perfect moment. Don't do that. Just use it. Even if it is slightly imperfect, it is way better than sitting on it for 2 whole minutes and losing multiple casts over the course of a key. Spirit Walker's Grace is your second and, honestly, more important mobility tool. This is what allows you to continually cast on the move, and you should be using it a lot more aggressively than most people do. Don't be afraid to send it on cooldown, especially in your Ascendance window or on boss mechanics that force a lot of movement. Because of how central Ascendance is to your damage, Spirit Walker's Grace effectively functions like a DPS cooldown in Mythic+. It's as simple as, the more uptime you have casting, the more Maelstrom you generate, the more spenders you get, and the more damage you deal. So the mindset with both of these buttons is don't treat them like panic buttons, treat them like uptime tools. The more you use Spirit Walker's Grace and Nature's Swiftness proactively, the less punishing movement becomes, and the more consistent your damage is going to be across an entire dungeon. And on top of those cooldowns, you also have 2 smaller movement tools that are also very easy to misuse or completely forget about. Tool number 1, Lava Burst. In AoE situations, you are never hardcasting Lava Bursts, but we have Lava Surge. There are only 2 situations when pressing Lava Burst in an AoE pack is actually correct, because you are either consuming it with Purging Flames and Lava Surge, or you're using that Lava Surge to avoid missing a global while you're moving to reposition. So if you're moving, don't feel bad about hitting Lava Burst, because that's damage you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But sometimes we just don't have the ideal, and in these situations where you don't have a Lava Surge proc, you should be setting Frost Shock as your fallback movement filler. While Frost Shock is not necessarily even always picked up, and it's not ever a part of your rotation, it's still better than doing nothing. But now we get to something a lot of Elemental Shamans struggle with, and that would be Lightning Rod. And I want to specifically talk about this because it has changed a little bit since last season. Lightning Rod's pretty strong, doing some of our top damage in a dungeon, and if we're talking about pure theoretical DPS, spreading it as much as possible to as many targets as possible is always the correct choice. But the problem with that is in real content, especially in Mythic+, raw DPS is not always the same thing as useful DPS. So instead of thinking in terms of is it right or is it wrong to spread Lightning Rod, the better question you should ask on every pull is, what actually matters more here, priority damage or overall AoE damage? If a pull has a particularly dangerous caster or a higher than average health mob, then your priority should be funneling damage into that mob with your Tempest procs. While Tempest does apply Lightning Rod, and while it is technically a DPS crease to do so, in real gameplay it's often not worth forcing it. Between the short duration of Lightning Rod and how awkward tab targeting can be in bigger pulls, it's usually more consistent to just send your Tempest into your priority target and then let Earthquake handle most of your Lightning Rod spreading naturally. In practice, almost all of your Lightning Rod spread comes from Earthquake, not from Tempest. And there's also a really important interaction here that newer Elemental Shaman players might not be aware of. If you cast Tempest and then you follow it up immediately with an Earthquake, in theory you should be applying 2 Lightning Rods, one from the Tempest target and one from the Earthquake hitting an adjacent target. But because of how the game processes these effects, Earthquake actually applies its Lightning Rod first to your main target, and then Tempest just refreshes Lightning Rod on the same target instead of applying it to a different one. So if you're chaining Tempest into an Earthquake and you want to get 2 Lightning Rods instead of just one, you need to start casting Tempest, and during that cast, tab target to a different mob before the cast ends, so Earthquake applies to a different mob. And I know that sounds janky, but just go test on some dummies and you'll see what I mean. Okay, but the last thing I want to talk about is something I've been doing more testing on, but I wanted to bring it up because it seems like this might be a really strong optimization if you're playing Master of the Elements. Even though we basically never cast Lava Burst in AoE unless it's specifically buffed by both Lava Surge and Purging Flames, there's a really important interaction here. Normally this would not be worth doing, however, since the current build forces us to use Lava Burst to proc for Purging Flames anyways, we may as well get as much value out of that Lava Burst as possible. When you consume Lava Surge with the Purging Flame buff, that Lava Burst generates a large amount of Maelstrom. And because of that, you almost always end up with enough Maelstrom to immediately follow up with an Earthquake after that. Since Master of the Elements grants you an additional 15% damage buff to your next spell, that means you can follow up every empowered Lava Burst directly with an empowered Earthquake. So instead of thinking of Master of the Elements as just a single target elemental weaving thing, you can treat it as a way to juice up your AoE spenders as well. In practice, the flow looks like this. You get a Lava Surge proc with Purging Flames up, you then cast Lava Burst and immediately dump the Maelstrom into an Earthquake to get the full value of the Master of the Elements buff. It's a small thing over the course of the dungeon, but it adds up in a meaningful amount of extra damage, and it makes your Lava Surge in AoE feel way more intentional instead of just something you press to clear the buff. Plus, it also kind of lets us double dip in AoE and single target. Not only does it add some fun complexity back to our rotation, but it also increases our single target damage as well. But that's all I have for you today. These small optimizations you can make when you apply them consistently add up to a noticeable amount of extra damage over the course of a dungeon. You don't need to fix or add them all at once because that's a surefire way to get overwhelmed, but just pick 1 or 2 things to focus on, and then once those become habit, move on to the next ones. That approach is way more effective than trying to overhaul everything at the same time because, trust me, it gets overwhelming. If this video helped you out, drop a like, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more Elemental content or general Warcraft content in the future. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.